My name is June Archer. I am 31 years old, and the cleanest cruelty I have ever known arrived as a text while I was still at my desk downtown. Blake wrote that I could come to dinner with Caroline Pierce's family, but I was not to mention I was his sister because her father was a federal judge. I read it twice, then set my phone face down beside a marked-up fraud brief. Because some insults land so neatly, they feel less like shock than recognition in your body. A minute later, my mother called with that soft, practiced warmth she used whenever she wanted something ugly to pass as reasonable, and told me a smaller table had been reserved. She meant the one near the service door, tucked behind the better view and the better china, where I could be present without making anyone uncomfortable. She never named who needed comfort, but she did not have to, because in my family, Blake was introduced with pride, and I was always edited into something easier. I told her I would be there, on time, in black, and quiet enough for all of them, then ended the call and watched my own reflection fade across the screen. What none of them understood was that the man they were so desperate to impress would know exactly who I was the second he saw my face. That was the only reason I said yes. Nothing in Blake's message surprised me as much as it should have, because my family had spent my whole life teaching me exactly how easily pride could be rationed. He was the son worth investing in, the one wrapped in tuition, coaching, confidence, and introductions. While I learned early that effort counted more than being celebrated for it. By the time he was selling luxury apartments to people who admired polish, I was prosecuting corruption cases in federal court and sending fraudsters home indicted instead. Daily. The difference never impressed my parents, because Blake's work photographed well and mine came home in bankers' boxes, redacted filings, and nights that ended under courthouse fluorescence after midnight often. Dana Whitaker was the first person who ever looked at my work without looking past me. And when I showed her Blake's text, her face went completely still. She asked for Caroline Pierce's name, then her father's. And the second I gave it to her, she leaned back and murmured, "So that is whose approval he thinks he is buying." I thought I would hear anger for my sake, maybe disgust. But Dana's silence landed differently because it carried recognition, calculation, and something steadier than sympathy. She knew Judge Russell Pierce by reputation and by room, which meant she also knew the kind of mistake Blake had just made without understanding it. When she told me, "Come anyway. I am not letting you walk into that dinner alone," the shape of the night changed before either of us left chambers. The private dining room sat high over downtown Chicago, all dark walnut, low gold light, and the kind of money on earth that never needed to introduce itself twice. When Dana and I stepped inside, my family had already arranged themselves into the picture they wanted perfectly, with Blake near the center and Caroline Pierce beside him like proof. He crossed to me wearing a smile that barely hid the strain, glanced at Dana, then introduced me to Caroline as June, someone who handled paperwork around the downtown courthouse. Caroline greeted me with polished warmth, the kind people use when they have been told to be gracious to someone safely beneath the evening's real importance tonight. A moment later, my mother appeared at my elbow and murmured that my place was off in the back, quieter there, which meant near the service entrance. Dana took the seat one table over without comment, close enough to witness everything in silence, while I sat where they wanted and let the room explain itself. Blake laughed too loudly at things that were not funny. My father kept smoothing his cuff as if composure could be pressed, and my mother watched faces instead of people. Judge Russell Pierce said little from the main table, but his eyes moved with deliberate patience, taking inventory of the room with measured calm while everyone else admired the surface. By the time servers began threading between tables with the first pour, I understood the seating had never been a mistake, only a decision dressed politely. Judge Russell Pierce took a champagne flute from the passing tray and began moving table to table with the easy formality of a man accustomed to rooms rising subtly around him. I watched him exchange brief pleasantries, pause where politeness required it, then turned toward the back as if some unfinished detail in the room had finally caught his attention. By the time he reached my table, Blake was still smiling at the main one, certain I had already been placed exactly where I could do the least damage. The change in Judge Pierce happened the instant he saw my face. Not slowly, not politely, but with the clean force of recognition overtaking whatever social script had brought him there. He stopped short enough that glass touched glass on the tray, then set it down and looked at me with open surprise. "June Archer, I did not know you were here tonight." I rose automatically, and before I could shape a safe answer, he added that he still remembered my argument in a federal procurement fraud hearing because very few lawyers made precision look that effortless. Silence moved across the room so fast it felt physical, and when I looked up, every head had already turned toward the table my mother had called quieter. Dana crossed over then, unhurried and exact, and Judge Pierce greeted her with the same immediate respect, which only sharpened the shock already spreading outward from us. His gaze returned to me, then slid past my shoulder toward the main table, and the question landed without raised volume or wasted force. "Why is Miss Archer seated back here?" Blake tried first. Because of course he did. And the smile he reached for collapsed halfway when he offered that I did not care much about where I sat. That sentence finished what recognition had started, because it told the room he had not simply misplaced me. He had grown comfortable deciding what should matter less to me. Judge Pierce pulled out the chair across from mine, sat down without glancing back at the main table. "And is on you, Don Dak," and in that quiet choice the whole evening turned against the people who had built it. My mother moved first, because she had always believed a softer voice could make damage look accidental, and offered a brittle explanation for the seating. Dana did not let that version breathe. She reached into her bag, unlocked her phone, and turned the screen toward Judge Pierce. Then, in the same calm tone she used in court, she read Blake's message exactly as he had written it. She read that I was welcome to attend, but I was not to tell anyone I was his sister, because Caroline's father was a federal judge and it would be embarrassing. No one interrupted her, and that made the words worse, because everyone in the room had to sit inside their shape together. Caroline looked at Blake first with confusion, then with the harder expression of someone realizing the insult had required planning before dinner began. Judge Pierce held out his hand, read the text once, then again, and asked Blake whether there was context that improved it. Blake reached for the same vanity that had built the lie and murmured that the message sounded bad out of context, as if context ever made contempt smaller. Caroline turned toward him and pressed where truth was weakest, reminding him he had described me as distant, informal, and barely involved in family life. That was when Judge Pierce set Dana's phone on the table and gave the room the sentence none of them could survive. This was not about keeping dinner simple. It was about fear of comparison. My father lowered his eyes. My mother went pale, and the pause before either of them tried to defend Blake told Caroline more than any confession could. I stayed quiet while the evidence finished speaking for me, because for once, silence was not surrender. It was proof. Caroline did not cry or raise her voice. She only looked at Blake with the stunned clarity of someone watching a polished surface split open at the seam. She asked how many versions of me he had edited for her, how many rooms he had entered carrying that same lie, and whether my parents had known all along. Neither of them moved quickly enough to help him, and in that hesitation, Caroline reached for her ring with steady fingers and slid it free. The sound it made against the table was small, but it ended the evening more completely than shouting could have done, because everyone understood what it meant. Blake came toward me then, not humbled, only desperate, and asked for a private conversation, like privacy had suddenly become sacred now that he needed protection from the room. I looked up at him and gave him the one thing he had denied me all night, the truth in public, telling him that if he was comfortable humiliating me in front of strangers, he could hear my answer in front of them too. Judge Pierce stood after that with the same measured control he had carried all evening and told Caroline to get her coat if she was ready to leave. Then he turned to Blake and made the end official in one clean sentence. There would be no wedding, no further discussion, and no future built on a man willing to diminish his own sister for advantage. I stayed where I was until they began moving, because I wanted the last thing my brother saw to be that I had not needed to rise against him to remain standing. By the next morning, the dinner had already begun circulating through the private Chicago circles. Blake had spent years trying to enter, not through headlines, but through people. In his business, reputation traveled faster than listings, and what followed him from that room was not scandal in the romantic sense, but a smaller, costlier word. Clients who trusted him with penthouses, co-ops, and quiet family money no longer saw polish when they heard his name. They saw a man who shrank people. Within days, his brokerage removed him from 2 high-value client tracks and quietly reassigned accounts he had been counting on to carry his year. No one accused him of breaking a law, which almost made it harsher, because this was not about legality, but about judgment, vanity, and reliability. By the end of the 3rd week, the meeting he had walked into, expecting damage control, became an invitation to resign gracefully before the firm had to decide. That was when the financial part began, because Blake had been living inside a future he had mistaken for guaranteed. An expensive confidence collapses quickly once belief leaves. The apartment lease bit first, then the car payment, then the dinners, the memberships, the tailored image, all the quiet monthly obligations supported by access. He had built his life on referrals, appearances, and proximity to people with more money than patience. And once those doors closed, the numbers stopped pretending. My parents called in stages, first asking me to speak to him, then asking me not to be cruel, then pretending the whole thing had somehow grown larger than intended. My mother wrote that family should not let one painful misunderstanding ruin a lifetime, and my father left a message saying Blake was under pressure. I deleted the email, let the voicemail expire, and understood with unusual calm that they did not want fairness. Only the old arrangement where I absorbed the cost and they kept the comfort. I read half of my mother's email about forgiveness before deleting it, changed my private number that afternoon, and told Chambers not to accept personal deliveries without review. None of it felt dramatic once I did it. It felt administrative, almost clean, like finally removing my name from a system that had billed me for years without consent. Dana never asked whether I was sure, only moved beside me as though protecting my peace required no special explanation once the evidence was in front of us. A month later, a handwritten note arrived from Caroline, brief enough to feel honest, and I kept it because honesty had become rare in the wreckage my family left. She wrote that what embarrassed her at dinner would have destroyed her in marriage, and that watching Blake diminish his own sister had shown her what his love would eventually cost. I folded the note back along its original crease and understood why it steadied me more than any apology from my parents could. The hardest thing to release was not Blake or the dinner, but the long habit of waiting for my family to catch up to who I already was. Once I stopped waiting, my days got quieter inside, even when work stayed hard and the courthouse lights kept burning late. Healing, as it turned out, was not forgiveness first. It was learning that peace begins the moment you stop volunteering to be reduced. 11 months later, I was entrusted with a larger public corruption case, the kind that did not come with fanfare, only heavier files, sharper scrutiny, and a different level of faith. Dana stood behind me the way she always had, without performance. And Judge Pierce spoke of my work in the plain professional language that means more because it asks nothing back. By then, I no longer needed praise to repair what my family had damaged, but being recognized cleanly, without reduction, felt like hearing my own name returned intact. At a small ceremonial gathering inside the office, I looked around the room and saw colleagues, mentors, and friends who had chosen me by conduct, discipline, and truth. No one there needed me quieter, easier, or less visible to make themselves feel settled. and that difference changed the air before anyone spoke. I thought once of the table near the service door, then let the memory pass without bitterness because it no longer held authority over me. The loud ending my brother feared never came. What came instead was simpler and final. I kept my work, my name, and the life that fit me without apology. In the end, that was enough. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the parts that hurt quietly. If any part of it felt like your own life, I hope it leaves you choosing peace, love, and a home inside yourself. Stay close and take gentle care of your heart.